The session for today is on variadic functions. So variadic functions are functions that can take a variable number of arguments. In other words, variadic functions are functions which take a variable number of arguments. So how do we receive an undefined number of arguments, and how do you read those arguments? And we're going to do some examples on that. So this is all about this session, and we also going to see a bit on pointers, because certain among us have some issues on pointers. So we can discuss a bit on that. So first of all, let's declare a function, define a function. And this is the main function. And let's define a function called the add function. This function takes up two arguments. The first argument is A, and the second argument is B. And this function add return the sum of A and B. I'm going to include the standard input-output library so we can display things. Great. Now, the next thing, we're going to run this program and see what displays. Let's define a variable called sum, and sum, we assigned the result from the call of the add function. So 50 plus 65. Then we use the printf function to display the value. Just a bit of formatting, yes. Let's run this code, gcc main.c. The output file name will be main. Then the main file, we execute it. And we see sum is equal to 115. So what is the problem now? This function receives a limited number or a fixed or defined number of arguments. In this case, we can pass only two arguments. So now, how do we have to find a way to pass in an unlimited number of arguments. So this is where variadic functions comes in. A variadic function can receive a variable number of arguments. So the first thing we're going to do, there is a library we need to include, and this library contains some important macros in this regard, the std.arg library. Great. So how to declare a variadic function? So to declare a variadic function, we need to use an ellipsis at the last parameter. So here is how it goes. Let's delete the content of this function, and let's add an ellipsis. So here, the first argument, we're going to say the count, or n, and the second argument will be an ellipsis. This will be the last parameter. So this ellipsis tells the compiler that this function may receive a variable numbers of a parameter or arguments. So then inside this function, we have to find a way to read the values of each of these arguments and do what we want to do with them. I'm just going to show you an example of how to call this kind of function. The first argument, int n, which is an integer, this is the number of arguments we're going to pass. For example, in here, how do we call this function? We can say we want to pass in five arguments, argument. Then we have then to specify the number, all these arguments. So we have 18, 38, 22, 50, and 60. I think this is 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have to specify the number of argument we pass to the function, because the add function has to know how many arguments has been passed. So by convention, we have to put in place a mechanism to let the add function to know about how many arguments has been passed. Great. And we can even call the same function with different number of arguments again. For example, let's say we want to pass in just 3 arguments, and that's it. So the first parameter is the number of arguments we are passing, and here are the arguments. The function add knows how many arguments are being passed, so it can know how many times it's need to look for values. Next, we're going to perform the sum inside here. So there are ways to read the argument we receive. There are certain macros we need to know about. I'm going to list them here and explain what is the use of each of these macros. The first one is varlist. The second is varstart. The other one is vararg. And the third that you're going to need is varend. So the val list is a defined type that holds informations needed by the varstart macro, and this will hold information about the list of arguments that has been passed. And the varstart macro, it is a macro function. This will enable us to access the variadic function arguments and initiate the list of arguments. And the next one, which is the vararg, this allows us to access the next variadic function argument. That means each time we call the vararg macro, it will return the value of the next argument. So you now understand why we need to pass in the number of arguments so that we knows how many times the vararg should be called. And next we have the varend. The varend also is a function macro. This will end the traversal of the variadic function arguments. What does that means? It's like we're done using the list and we want to end things. So basically, these are the 3 things we need to know. Great. Let's define or declare a variable, and we're going to call it val list, and this will hold informations about the list of arguments. And next, we're going to define a variable called sum. So this will be the sum or contain the results of the additions. Then next, we define an I variable, which allows us to loop through from the first argument to the last argument. Then here we have to do the initialization. We have to initiate the list. For that, we call the var start macro. The var start macro receives two parameters. The first one is the list that should contain the informations of the list of parameters or arguments. And the second parameter that it receives is the last arguments before the ellipses. So here we have to specify in n. Now this list has been initialized, and that means we can now access the arguments. The next thing is we have to end. We have to call the var end macro so that this will end the traversal of the variadic functions. So it's like freeing the resources. And that's it. We initialize the list, and here we're done reading, and now we closed everything up. Now here we can now read the contents in the list, the content of the list. How do we do that? We know how many arguments we received. So we can use the for loop for I is equal to 0, I lesser than n, I plus plus. So from the first argument to the last argument, we read and we do the sum. The sum will be equal to, we read var arg, then we pass in the list. The var arg will look into the list and read the next argument. So each time you call the var arg macro, it will read the next argument in the list. Now the second information that the macro receive is the type of the arguments or the type of the next argument. In our case, we want to pass in integer values, so we type in int. Great. So if the arguments name types change, for example, if we pass in things like strings, we would have to change it to something like char start, or if we pass in things like characters or pointers, we might specify things like that. So the type we specify in a second parameter depend on the type of the next argument. And here we're done, we return the sum. Let's call this function twice. The first call is here. We call printf. So sum equal to, then I'm going to display. And the second call will be that. So here we call the add function using 5 parameters. and here we call it using three parameters, knowing, and also the add function knows about how many parameter we've passed in. Let's compile this code and see what it does. gcc main.c, the output file name will be main. Great. So let's run this code and see. And here is the result. Sum is equal to 180. This is from the first call. And the second call, we've passed in three arguments. And the first argument here is the number of parameters so that the add function knows how many arguments we've passed. So here, the second call give us 78. So we can pass in as many arguments as we want. So let's say something like that. So if you pass in all this, still you can compile the code. But here we did not specify the exact number of arguments. So the add function will only read these three arguments if we compile this code. So we're going to make sure that it reads all these arguments. So let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So now we tell the add function we've passed 9 arguments. 9 arguments. Then let's see. I did not save the code. Let's compile the code again. And here we have, on the second call, we have 2002. So that's it. This is how we read variable numbers of arguments. We first have to initialize an object, which is the values type, using the macro, the var_start macro. We pass in the list, the values object, then the last arguments that the function received before the ellipsis. Then after that, we read the arguments one by one. Since the add function knows how many arguments has been passed, we can just loop over and read these arguments and then add the sum. The var_arg macro read, and we also have to pass in the second parameter, the type of the argument we are going to read. And last, we clean up things, so var end, and after that we return the result. Now let's see, let's say if we want to, for example, display string of characters, that also is possible. We're going to declare a function for that. I'm going to delete this one and going to delete also this code. So here is the print. We're going to define a function that doesn't return anything. It is called print. It will print some strings. And this function will receive a variable number of parameters. So the first parameter will be the number of variables arguments that the function going to receive. And we use the ellipses to tell that the function receive a variable number of arguments. Then next, what we do, we declare our valist object. So this will be called L. This time I'm going to call it L. And now let's give a name that makes sense. And next, we're going to declare a variable called I, so we can loop over all these arguments. The next, what we can do is to initialize the list object. So we call the var start, then we pass in the list object, and at the second parameter, we pass in the end, which is the last argument before the ellipsis. And here we type in the code. And after that, when we're done, we call var end to free up the object. Great. So how do we display strings, or how do we display things? So here is we can do it similarly as before. For I is equal to 0, I lesser than n, I plus plus. So we're looping over the arguments. Then we call the printf function and displays those strings. So for that, we're going to call the var macro, and it will return the next the value of the next argument. In our case, the value type is char start. So that means it is receiving pointers to strings, or in other words, it must return a string. And then this will be displayed by the printf function. So just make sure that the value, the type of the argument you received are the same as in here, because if you made a mistake about the argument, the types, this will cause errors down the line. Let's compile this code and see what happened. First, let's call the function. So prints, then the number of arguments, we're going to pass in 5 elements, just 3 elements, 3 arguments. The first argument, the first string argument is hello, and the second one will be a space, then a dash and a space, and then the other will be world with a line break. Next, let's compile this code and see what it does. And that's it. It displays these strings one by one. So the printf function receives the number of arguments we're passing. Here we're passing just we're passing 3 arguments, and these arguments are all of the same type. There are strings, so there are char start type. And in the print function, we initialize the list. This is always the case. It doesn't change. And we created an I variable, which is the index used to loop over. Then here we initialize the list object. We pass in the second parameter as the last parameter before the ellipsis. So since we know how many arguments we received, so we know how many times we need to call the var function. And then we call the var end. So we're to say that we're done with the list. So what you see here, we are not required to pass in. We're not required to say that all these arguments must be the same type, but we can pass in mixed different arguments with different types. For example, we can say 55, this is an integer, and we can pass in, for example, a character like a, and we can also pass in a strings. And then after, if you want, you can pass in something like a floating number. Example, something like that, 1.63. And still, this is a valid call to this function, but this will erase a new kind of problem. Here in the loop, we said that for each argument we're reading, we expect to receive a char type. But here, these arguments have different types, so the types are mixed up. Let's run this program and see what will happen. GCC, and then we pass in the main.c and execute. Now we receive this error, segmentation fault. Why? That's because since the first reading here, the first argument, the var arg is reading, is of type integer, but we tells him that we want to read a char type, a char star type, a string, which is not the case. That is why we have this error. So how to resolve this? The printf function knows how many arguments it has, but it doesn't know what are the types of these arguments. But we're going to find a way to display these arguments right now. So for the first call, we know that we're reading an integer. So I'm going to say printf, and we displays the integer. So var arg, the first reading, we are reading an integer. So the first argument after the count, we're reading an integer. Then the next, we are reading a character. So we're going to display a character. var arg list, and we tell the var arg function we are reading a character. So there is a things to take in account here. So when you are reading characters, you should specify int instead of char. So this is something to just take note about. Else, if you pass in char, the compiler might let you know that it is not, this is wrong. Okay. And next we have the printf function. We call the next argument we passed is a string. So we call the var arg then list char start, because the type of the third argument is a string. So we call the var arg, and the next call will be on this one. We'll return the value for this one, the hello world. Then next, we are reading a floating point number. So the var arg, we going to specify the value type of this. So this is a double. We could have specified something like float, but this is not actually what the var arg expect. It's the same case we had here when we try to display characters. So for the floating point numbers, we should specify double. Let's compile this code. So we have passed 4 arguments and we read 4 arguments. Now let's compile the code and see what happened. Now execute. This will be hello world. And that's it, 58. Then the character A, then hello world, then the value 1.663. So what if we change the order of these arguments or these parameters? Let's say we going to change the order. We're going to so the first argument will be a string, and the second one will be an integer. So the same way, we also have to reflect that in the code. So here we have to change the order, because if we don't read the arguments in the correct order regarding their type, the var arg might cause some errors. So make sure that things are in the correct orders regarding to the type. And also we can only call the var arg as many times as we have as many times as the number of argument we have. So here we can only call the var arg 4 times. So let's compile this code and see what will happen. So gcc main.c, then that. And when you execute, so hello world come first, and we have the values. So that's it. Someone asked a question if I want to so I did not really understand the question, but the idea here is that when you want to read floating point numbers that have decimal parts, you should specify double for the var arg function, or maybe you can rephrase so that it will be easier for me to understand. And we are at the limit of the 40 minutes. Let's stop the session and start it again. So I'm going to stop the session. You can still connect using the same link.